Welcome back, Inspector. Your session is now live.
Right, thank you. Yeah, good afternoon again. I'm going to resume the inquiry, and any matters that anyone wants to bring up before I hand over to Mr. Howell Williams to call his witness on landscape matters. Mr. Howell Williams, if you'd like, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, sir. I'd like to introduce Mr. Withercombe to the inquiry. You are David Withercombe, and your qualifications and experience are set out at the beginning of your main proof of evidence.
Yes, that's correct. So it's I've just noticed the afternoon sun is reflecting off the wall behind me. Is that okay? That's okay. Thank you.
In terms of the documents to which you'll be referring, we haven't produced a list because I can see that the inspector is, during the proceedings, largely looking at soft copy, but I can indicate that he needs to have close to hand your main proof of evidence, your rebuttal evidence, and your appendices, of course, and also the landscape statement of common ground and the evidence of Mr. Smith.
That's correct, yeah.
And there may also be a need to refer to the illustrative master plan as well as the LVIA.
Correct, thank you.
There may be others, but I think those are the main documents. So looking at the introduction in your proof of evidence, we can see that you were appointed to deal with this matter in November last year as an independent expert witness in relation to landscape and visual matters. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
And underneath at 1.2, you refer and quote in full the reasons for refusal, which you're going to refer to. And in your evidence, you refer to reason for refusal 2, dealing with the landscape and visual impact matters on the appeal site. The next reason for refusal focuses on Appledore Road and the avenue of trees. And of course, you also refer to the landscape impacts and detrimental effects of significant trees on the site.
Correct.
I think in large part, partly because we've covered the last 2 matters in some detail in the round table session, the focus of the evidence, or oral evidence in chief, is going to be on reason for refusal number 2. Is that correct?
Yes, that sounds good.
Looking over the page, we can see that in paragraph 1.6, you refer to the case management conference held on the 8th of December last year, at which the inspector indicated a preliminary view about the principal issues that were going to be discussed at the inquiry. And you refer to those in paragraph 1.7.1. And insofar as they are referred to and reflect the reasons for refusal, your evidence deals with those matters, doesn't it?
It does. I set out how I wish to address this key question of the impacts and effects on character and appearance of the surrounding area. I identified those 4 bullet points as key ways in which I address that.
Thank you. Do you wish to read those sections? Or
I can read those through. Yeah. So starting at paragraph 1.7, I consider that the principal landscape and visual issues are the anticipated effects of the proposals on the character and appearance of the surrounding area, in particular with reference to the contribution the land makes to the landscape setting of Tenterden, which is identified in reason for refusal 2. in paragraph 65 of the officer's report to Planning Committee, 15th December, document CD 4.727, this notes that the existing settlement has an attractive, leafy and relaxed feel, which creates an edge that has a verdant, relaxed character and setting that gently manages the entrance into the town from the surrounding area, surrounding countryside. My evidence will assess the character and appearance of the settlement edge and the contribution this makes to the wider character and setting of the settlement of Tenterden, and whether the proposals would alter the character and appearance of the settlement edge. Bullet point 2, the overall character and appearance of the existing landscape and those features which contribute to character and appearance. And that's identified in reasons for refusal 2, 3 and 4. At para 65 of the officer's report, it's concluded the appeal site has a strong rural appearance located outside the built confines of Tenterden. My evidence will address the character and appearance of the existing landscape and the degree to which the proposals would impact on specific elements or features and overall character and appearance. Bullet point 3, visual effects as a consequence of the removal of existing features in local and on local views. Reason for refusal 2, 3 and 4. My evidence will review visual impacts primarily from publicly accessible viewpoints. And I would highlight in particular the views from public right-of-way AB12, which runs through the appeal site. And finally, we're looking at the appropriateness of the proposal in terms of design, layout, and the scale and quantum of development as identified in reason for refusal 2. And my evidence will consider each of these elements in the context of the consequent landscape and visual effects in order to draw conclusions as to the appropriateness of the proposed development in this location.
Thank you very much. And if the inspector turns the page and makes a mental thumb tag at 1.13 to note the key areas in relation to the LVIA that you're going to return to in a short while. What I'd like you to do now, though, is to, hopefully in a logical way, turn to section 4 of your evidence and assist the inspector by reference to the text in section 4 with your summary views about the description of the site and the baseline landscape character.
Okay, thank you. So within that section 4, I set out my assessment of the baseline, the base landscape character of the appeal site. I think that's all hopefully fairly clearly set out in the proof of evidence. I just want to highlight perhaps 2 or 3 points. The first one is the landform of the appeal site. I acknowledge that there is a shallow ridge which runs north to the south across the appeal site, mainly in the central part of the site, and this is the ridge that is followed by footpath AB12. However, I just want to highlight, and I think there's we want to go to it, there's a plan in the design and access statement at page 16, which shows the line of the ridge. The key point I want to highlight is that as you move towards the southern part of the site, and this is the proposed area for these sports pitches, that ridge becomes distinctly less pronounced. In fact, that land is, to all intensive purposes, flat. I think I'll come back to this in terms of perhaps in assessment of landscape and visual effects. So I think within the description of the appeal site, a description which to a large extent I agree with, a distinction is made between the western and eastern land parts of it.
And if we just pause there for a moment, the inspector may be looking at CD 1.2, the design and access statement, page 16.
Correct.
And there is an aerial photographic view of the appeal site with contours and a diagrammatic indication of the north-south ridge.
Yes. So my point is that that ridge does read as a landscape feature in the northern part of the site, but far less so in the southern parts of the site.
Thank you very much. And then if you would turn to paragraph 4.10 of your evidence, and I think it would be useful to read from here, please.
Yes, so 4.10, I think, gives my summary and overview of the character and appearance of the appeal site and how this is reflected to the degree to which it reflects key characteristics as described in the published landscape character assessments. So in my opinion, the whole of the appeal site reflects many of the key characteristics described in the Woodchurch Undulating Farmlands LCA landscape character area of an undulating landscape, mixed farmland with little intensive land use, varied field pattern, field ponds and narrow stream corridors. Whilst I acknowledge that there are areas with a more enclosed character, parts of the appeal site offer more open, expansive views, even within the western land parcel. And I reference my viewpoint L6, perhaps to illustrate this. There are small pockets of woodland and scrub associated mainly with the ponds. The land was, let's say, when I visited the site in November, the land was not undergrazing, but I understand it is quite regularly grazed, but the land was undergrazing until relatively recently. In my view, there is something of a transition across the appeal site from west to east. And this goes from what I describe as, I consider to be the wooded settlement edge, across the more partially enclosed landscape of the western parts of the site, to the more expansive open landscape on the eastern side of the ridge. This, in my view, is an important characteristic of the settlement edge and the setting to Tenterden.
Thank you.
I think,
sorry,
I was just going to say that as part of this transition, there is, in my view, a small, you move from the settlement edge across the appeal site to the more open eastern expanse. The whole of the appeal site, fundamentally, in my opinion, retains a strong rural character. There is some or limited influence from the settlement edge. You can see properties, of course you can, from the western land parcel. But my view is that because of the nature of that settlement edge, the influence of those properties on character and appearance is relatively limited.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you now to comment on the inspector's decision letter in what we can refer to as the 1989 appeal decision.
Yeah, thank you.
So core document 6.1, I think, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I think the short answer is, as I set out in my proof of evidence, is that I think the conclusions of the inspector as to the character and appearance, the contribution of the appeal site to the landscape setting to Tenterden remain valid. And I think this was reinforced at the local plan inquiry in 2010, in which the inspector again drew the same conclusion in determining not to allocate this site. That the land is an important countryside wedge, which is the local plan describes as one of the defining characteristics of the town of Tenterden. And this site continues to contribute to that overall settlement pattern, but specifically, obviously, in relation to this part of the town.
Since 1989 or 2010, has the character and appearance of the appeal site changed in any significant way so that the inspector's conclusions in both cases would not hold true?
Well, obviously, I wasn't on the inquiry in 1989. The one thing I have been able to do, and I include this at Appendix 3 of my appendices, is to look at the aerial image on Google Earth. And I think the point that I would highlight in looking at those aerial images is that you can clearly see that the settlement pattern hasn't changed since 1989. The landscape pattern hasn't changed significantly. And the one fundamental change I think you can see is that much of the vegetation in the hedges and within the appeal site, and indeed on the settlement boundary, in particular to Woodchurch Road, has matured. So in that sense, my argument would be that the opinions expressed in 89 and 2010 remain valid.
Thank you. Now I'd like to ask you about the appeal scheme itself, and again, hopefully, helpfully, and taking into account the fact that we've read your evidence and must keep an eye on the clock, but giving you enough time to make the key points you want to make in your oral evidence. Could I ask you to turn to section 5 and ask you to summarise the position in relation to the proposed development and any points you want to make in particular before turning to the work in the landscape and visual impact assessment?
I think perhaps one of the principal points I want to make is that compared to the 250 dwelling scheme, which was refused approval, the extent, shall I say, of residential development, i.e. the area of the site which is under roads or residential development, is largely the same. It's almost unchanged. So despite what is effectively almost a 40% reduction in the number of dwellings, we gain very little in terms of accessible open space, etc. So the benefits associated with that reduction, such a significant reduction in dwellings on this site, remain limited, in my view. So it is in many ways, I think, testament to the constraints that you find on this particular site, which in particular, and I absolutely support this approach to retain the pattern of hedgerows and hedgerow trees, is that by its nature, that means that development is confined to a series of parcels within the appeal site. So it constrains, there are a number of constraints on this site: the need to retain a buffer to the properties on Woodchurch and Appledore Road. All these factors come together to constrain both the area that can be put to residential development and the layout. I think I've raised the points in my proof of evidence as to the comparative densities and the character, appearance and layout of the neighbouring residential areas compared to the appeal scheme. I think we are moving from relatively low densities on Appledore Road and Woodchurch Road to markedly increased densities in the parts of the development which will back onto those roads. And although you'll get a gradation to a slightly less intensive development on the eastern fringes, it is still substantially greater than anything you see in Woodchurch and Appledore Road at the present time.
And how helpful to the inspector is the reference made by Mr. Smith to the other sites in Tenterden and the density calculations he takes from them?
Yeah, the first point I make is I have no reason to contest those numbers, but I think that the fundamental points, and I'd like to invite you on the site visit to look in particular. I think the two principal schemes referred to are the Tilden Gill Road, which is conveniently very close to the appeal site, and so can be easily visited, and the southern extension. In my view, the discussion on densities is important in the context of each individual site. And I think, so I'd invite you to view this on the site visit. If you approach Tilden Gill Road through the existing residential streets, there is not, to my mind, a perception of a marked contrast in density character of the residential development. And similarly, with regard to the southern extension, I would invite you to walk the high-wheeled landscape trail from the town centre through the existing areas of the southern extension, which have already been built out, to the current settlement edge. The southern extension, I think, is a point that's raised in more detail in the proof of evidence by Mr. Smith, and obviously within my rebuttal as well.
Thank you. Could you turn now to highlight comments that you make in your written evidence about the landscape and visual impact appraisal which accompanied the application, and turn to, as a starting point, page 4 of your proof of evidence, and look at paragraph 1.13.
Yeah, so I raised 4, but first of all, I think the point I want to emphasise is obviously that I've confirmed to Ashford Borough Council that the approach and methodology is consistent, is consistent with current guidance, principally that, of course, set out in Glydia, and have raised no particular issues with the approach and methodology taken in the LBA. Sorry. One point I just perhaps want to highlight, it's more an academic point. This is not a criticism, if you like, of the methodology. In terms of the baseline assessment of landscape receptors, Glydia requires the assessment to take account of the proposed use or the proposed development. And this can tend to underplay, I think, aspects such as landscape sensitivity. Because if you actually read, it perhaps gives the impression that the eastern land parcel is less sensitive than the western land parcel. The reason that conclusion is drawn is because it takes account of the fact that the eastern land parcel is proposed as country park and the western is proposed as residential. So I'd say it's perhaps a bit of an academic point, but not one I just really want to sort of highlight. I don't think there should be a perception that the eastern part of the site is less sensitive than the western land parcel. Yeah, the second point is whether the LBA properly assesses impacts and effects on the landscape setting to Tenterden. I think this is a point which is picked up more. Obviously, we didn't have the proof of evidence of Mr. Smith at the time. This is a point which is picked up more in the evidence of Mr. Smith, in which he does look at the settlement edge. But I think within the LVA, which was available to the council at the time of reaching the decision, the impact on landscape setting or settlement and edge to Tenterden, whilst it's acknowledged as a key issue in the LBA, it's highlighted obviously in the policy which informs provides the context to the LBA. It's not really directly addressed in the assessment. settlement edge is mentioned in, I think it's 2 of the landscape receptors. But in the discussion in the LBA, there wasn't really a consideration of the character appearance of the existing settlement edge and the potential effects on that character and appearance. But as I say, that has to a large extent been picked up in the evidence of Mr. Smith. The third point is the weight attributed to the findings of the LBA, specifically with regard to the magnitude of the landscape and visual effects, and to some extent whether these actually substantiate the views of the council that proposed are unacceptable. Firstly, I think I'd like to highlight that I agree that, as stated in the landscape statement of common ground, the impact and effects are relatively localized. It is essentially the appeal site, because the decision is made to restrict development to Western land parcel. We are essentially talking about impacts and effects on the appeal site and the immediate surrounding area of Woodchurch Road and Appledore Road. And that geographic extent should be taken account in the impact assessment. So that understanding is taken account in as part of the impact assessment of the LBA process. So I think I just wanted to highlight that, and at some point I would want to sort of just to highlight the principal landscape and visual effects, and I'm not sure if now's a good time to do so,
Yes,
which I have in my paragraphs 6.1 and 6.2 and 7.1 and 7.2.
thank you.
So am I okay to go to those?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
And do please refer to any plans or photographs to assist.
I will do, yeah. So looking at my paragraph 6.1, table D4 of the LBA provides a summary of the anticipated landscape effects of the proposed development on a range of landscape receptors. And again, I have no issues with the landscape receptors identified. But in particular, I want to highlight the effects on landscape elements and features and aesthetic, perceptual and overall landscape character. The LBA concludes that there will be major negative landscape effects on the enclosed pasture fields and a football pitch to the west of the footpath, and this points some influence from the settlement edge, but that conclusion of major negative landscape relates to those elements. And secondly, overall character, and that relates to the enclosed Woodchurch undulating farmlands, i.e. if one accepts that the appeal site reflects key characteristics of that character area, then the conclusion of the LBA is that there will be substantial negative landscape effects. The LBA also concludes there would be moderate negative landscape effects to the enclosed medium scale proximity of the settlement edge to the west of the footpath, and the prominence of St Mildred's Church at the west of the site, i.e. views to the church. Now, there are a number of views included in the LBA with photo montages illustrating the views to St Mildred's Church, where these will be retained. I think one point I'd like to highlight is that there are substantial lengths of footpath AB12 where you will lose those views. I won't disagree that those are the principal views. I guess I'm drifting into visual here rather than landscape. But there are sections of that path, and that would affect your experience of the use of the path. So what the LBA is concluding is that these proposals would result in moderate to major permanent negative or adverse effects to the overall landscape pattern and the settlement edge. Key characteristics as described in the published LCA, the perception of the landscape which forms the settlement edge, and the views to St Mildred's Church. Just moving on to my para 6.3, and this is why I wanted to highlight the effects, the consequences of that loss of the ridge in the southern parts of the site. Is I think in the southern part of the site, you will, largely because of the fact you have a flat landscape, you will have major negative effects to the landscape receptor extending to the east of footpath AB12. Except for the northern parts, because of the benefits that will be accrued as a result of the creation of the country park and the orchard and other features, this isn't such an issue. But I think that applying that conclusion to the whole of the land to the east of footpath AB12 is perhaps not necessarily, in my view, the conclusion I would draw in relation to the southern part of the site. So moving on to visual effects, that I mainly summarise in my paragraph 7.1. Again, I have no issue with the viewpoints used in the LBA. I think they provide a good representation of the views to the appeal site. And in my view, the principal negative visual effects relate to three principal landscape receptors, visual receptors. Firstly, it's the walkers using footpath AB12. It's pedestrians, vehicle users, and residents in the vicinity of the access from Appledore Road, and also the views from the rears of properties on Appledore Road and Woodchurch Road. Now, in all those cases, in terms of AB12, and I've listed in para 7.2 the principal viewpoints from footpath AB12. And again, the LVA concludes that there will be permanent negative visual effects for walkers using footpath AB12 from these locations. I'd agree with that assessment. It may be a useful point to look at some of the photo montages that have been supplied as part of the LVA to demonstrate those points. And so the LV
CD 1.12.
Thank you very much. It's one of the
And I think maybe the starting point when the inspector gets to the document is to look at the viewpoint location plan, I think.
Yeah.
And that's at T-6.
with that.
So when
Yeah, okay.
has got there, I think. So do you have that document?
Yes, I've got that in front of me now. Yeah.
Beg your pardon. Thank you.
So as T-6 identifies a series of viewpoints along the line of footpath AB12. Say those are viewpoints 5, B, 9A and 13. And we've also got one which shows the view from the entrance, the access to the footpath from Woodchurch Road. And as you move down through that document, I'm not sure it's on the second part of the CD. The second to last page shows the first of the views, photo montages. And I think that the point, Karen.
Sorry,
yeah, I think the point there is that I think again the impact assessment that's supplied as part of the LBA should be taking into account all the factors: geographic extent, nature of the built form, the landscape setting, the mitigation that might be being provided in reaching the conclusion. And the conclusion in relation to that viewpoint is a major permanent adverse effect. So although there are benefits, I can understand, I can obviously see that the view to the church has been retained. There is a marked change in the character and appearance of that view.
Forgive me, Mr. Withercombe. I'm awfully sorry because sometimes the connection is.
Yeah, is that me? Sorry.
No, it's not you. I missed the particular viewpoint. And bear in mind, Mr. White and I have hard copies in front of us.
That's viewpoint 5.
Viewpoint 5. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think the point I'd raise is that you can see, I think this is an important point, is that in terms of your perception of the settlement edge, the only publicly accessible location that you gain a perception of the settlement edge is from footpath AB12. And if you look at the existing view, you can see that it is very much a filtered view of the settlement edge. And then moving to the photo montage, we have a very much more exposed settlement edge. And this, bear in mind, this photo montage says it is the view at year 5. So this is not just after completion. This is at the point when any landscape mitigation, planting, which might be used to frame or soften that view, will have started to read in the landscape. I think you then need to go to the second part of CD 1.12. Viewpoint 9, which is the third page. And I think the comments I would make are very similar to those I make in relation to the previous viewpoint.
Now, is this one of the 3 views that the appellant has provided for in the layout to show St Mildred's Church?
Yes.
So what are your comments about the change and the impacts here from the current position to the year 5?
Again, I think the important point is, again, perception of the settlement edge. The current, you can just about glimpse properties on the settlement edge in the current view. That, in my view, opinion, retains a strong rural character. There is obviously a substantial change to the character and appearance of that view with the proposed appeal scheme. And again, emphasis that this is, I'm pretty sure it is referenced as being at year 5. So one would expect to see some sort of, if there is mitigation in terms of planting to soften the appearance of built form, one would expect that to be evident. So I think Mr. Smith in his evidence references positive effects, and I don't disagree that if you're retaining the views, that is obviously a benefit. But taking all these factors into account, the LVA concludes that there is a major to moderate permanent adverse effect in these views. And to 2 points, perhaps leading on from my thoughts here on the LVA, my final bullet is that if my practice prepared an LVA in relation to a scheme and concluded such negative or adverse or harmful, anticipated harmful effects, we would to a large extent have gone back to the drawing board and reviewed the scheme. And that, of course, is what Glivia requires you to do, where you identify significant adverse effects, is to consider whether there is further mitigation which could be provided to mitigate the effects, the identified adverse effects. So I think really this would sort of lead me to conclude that the scheme before the inspector, I appreciate reserve matters, but with this landscape-led approach, it should be giving you the best possible scenario to accommodate this level of development on this site. But despite that, there is still a conclusion that there are a number of substantial adverse landscape and visual effects associated with the proposals. And can I just move on to conclude this? In the LVA at page 31, and also para 213 of Mr. Smith's proof of evidence, we're told that such effects are in some ways almost an inevitable outcome of all greenfield residential developments. In my paragraph 6.8, I explain why I disagree with that conclusion. I take the point. In the majority of cases, perhaps unless one's dealing with a particularly degraded landscape edge or an exposed or open settlement edge, the assessment is likely to conclude that there will be localized negative or adverse landscape and visual impacts as a consequence of development. But in this case, the LVA concludes there will be major or moderate permanent negative or adverse effects to a number of key landscape receptors and probably the most important views across the appeal site from footpath AB12. The point I want to make is that the identified impacts and effects are specific to this development in this location, and they're not a consequence, an inevitable consequence of all greenfield residential development. So I think that in terms of references and points to the LVA, I think those are the main points I'd like to raise.
Good. Thank you very much, Mr. Withicombe. I'd like to ask you next, unless you've got anything further on the assessment of landscape and visual effects so far as the appeal site is concerned, and AB 12 in particular. I'd like to ask you now about AB 70 and the order road for the public right of way.
Yeah. So I pick up on this in my main proof of evidence at para 7.6 and also my rebuttal in paragraphs 19 and 20. In my main proof of evidence, I reference, of course, the evidence of Kate Bezic, KCC rights of way, and that her assessment as to the deliverability of the proposed AB 70 within, if the development were allowed to go ahead. I'd just like to highlight a few points on, you'll forgive me, I've not been able to find the plan, I will call it 0003, which is the illustrative master plan with the footpath shown on it on the CDs.
I can help you with that, Mr. Withycombe. If you recall, it came in fairly recent exchange. I don't think to you, but to Ms. Bezic, and it can now be found in Mr. Ross's Appendix G.
Right, thank you.
Well, you better pause there. So the inspector needs to find the document and the appendix.
At the same time, it would be helpful to have the original landscape master plan, which I think is CD 1.27.
Thank you.
Yeah, it is. Have you got those documents, sir?
I've got Appendix G of Mr. Ross. Seems to, it's a letter and Appendix G. I'm just trying to find it. There's some plans anyway. Letters on, yes. And sorry, what was the other?
The illustrative master plan, the original.
Yeah, I've got the illustrative master plan in hard copy here.
Yeah.
Yes, I can see, because I've got a copy of the plan showing the different. Yes, that does seem to highlight it. But I've got another plan that's come from evidence.
So you should have three plans: the illustrative master plan, which is before you as an appeal drawing.
Yes.
Plan, and then there are two plans in Mr. Ross's Appendix G.
Yes, I've got that. I've got the two plans there. Yes.
And just by way of introduction, the paragraph 8.56 of Mr. Ross's evidence, he says the first is a plan provided to show how footpath AB 70 could be accommodated on its proposed alignment through the area where only outline consent is sought. And then he says the second shows a potential diversion of the footpath. So I don't know which order you want to take them in, Mr. Withycombe, but I'd like
I think probably I would focus on 003. I have to confess, I've not really been able to pick up any substantive difference between
No.
002 and 003. I believe it should relate to the footpath around the car park and the pavilion.
Well, there are one or two other
Yeah,
changes, but it takes some detection work.
yeah.
to find them.
But I think all I really want to do, sir, is focus on the route of AB70, which, now I'm not sure if that exactly accords to the proposed route of AB70 as per the order. I believe it differs slightly, in particular in the northern parts, but that I would need to have confirmed. But the point I want to make is, at the moment, AB70 would run through that existing landscape that you saw in the views from AB12, and I think is also picked up in the various viewpoints of the western land parcel, which will give you a feel for the course. You'll see it on the site, but will give you a feel for the character and appearance of that western land parcel. And that proposed, that route as shown within the development, to my mind, that is not accommodating the route of the footpath. It is merely showing it running through the development. If this were an existing footpath, it's not made as a, but if this were an existing public right of way within a proposed development, you would have that be protecting that public right of way by putting it in a broad landscape corridor. You would not, as appears to be the case, for instance, in the more southerly sections of the site, be running it along the back of gardens between dwellings. It would be being taken into account as part of the master plan. And I think it's also important to point out that there are minor differences. If you compare the submitted illustrative landscape master plan with the proposed, with this 003 plan, those land parcels in the sort of southwestern part of the site, if you could compare those to the original master plan, there are differences in the layout. Now you've obviously got figures and on densities, you've got figures on areas of developable land that have been submitted. I would question whether those changes may or may not affect those figures. But I think the main point I'd make is that, as I say, this shows a line going through a development. It is not setting a public right of way in an appropriate landscape corridor, shall I say, which will protect the amenity and enjoyment of that public right of way. And even having said that, the whole, as I say, returning to my first point, the whole experience of that right of way, if it were made, would be wholly changed. That's what I want to pick up on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And lastly, Mr. Withycombe, I'd like you to read, please, as your summary and conclusions, section 8. And in this section, you recall we're going back to the inspector's identified issues.
Yeah, so I set this final section largely out on the basis of the 4 points I raised as my approach to addressing the key issues raised by the inspector in relation to character and appearance. I'll probably start from the bullet from 8.2. So in terms of my assessment of the contribution the land makes to this landscape setting of Tenterden, I conclude the land makes an important contribution to the appeal site, to the landscape setting of Tenterden. The appeal site is integral to the settlement pattern and forms a wedge of countryside extending towards the centre of the town. The existing settlement edge mainly comprises mature gardens with wooded boundaries, except there are a few more open aspects to some properties on Appledore Road. Nonetheless, in my view, the perception of the settlement edge is one of a gradual transition from the settlement through a predominantly wooded settlement edge to the western land parcel within which there is limited influence exerted by the existing residential development on character, and then through to the more open, expansive views to the wider countryside of the Weald on the eastern side of the ridge. The proposals would transform this settlement edge to one of a more defined, prominent and exposed residential settlement edge to the west of the crest of the ridge, bordering footpath AB12. In my view, the findings of the inspector of the 1989 inquiry remain relevant to assessment of the contribution of the appeal site to the landscape setting to Tenterden, in that a significant element in its character derives from the close proximity of the countryside to the heart of the town. In my opinion, the appeal site continues to contribute substantially to this character. The second point, the overall character and appearance of the existing landscape and those features which contribute to character and appearance. The proposed development would transform the overall character and appearance of the land to the west of footpath AB12 from the existing rural landscape, which reflects key characteristics of the Woodchurch Undulating Farmlands LCA, to an area with a strong residential character. Whilst development would enable the retention of the majority of the network of hedges, ponds and watercourses, the overall context of these features as part of a rural landscape would be lost. The photomontages in the LVA illustrate the impacts and effects of the proposals on the character and appearance of the appeal site. The proposals would result in the loss of an important avenue tree on Appledore Road, as we picked up this morning, which would permanently harm the character and appearance of the avenue. And the evidence of Mr. Cook also concludes the proposals will result in harm to T381 on the appeal site. There is recognition in the LVA that there would be a permanent, major, moderate adverse effects on overall landscape and elements and features in the western land parcel, and there's no indication as to how this harm could be mitigated. I would agree with these conclusions. I do not agree with the conclusion of the LVI that such significant effects are an inevitable result of all greenfield residential developments on the settlement edge. The conclusions of the LVA are specific to this location development. They also include an assessment of landscape value informed by the factors described in the LI Technical Guidance Note 0221, assessing landscape value outside national designations. Whilst I accept that valued landscape is not cited in reasons for refusal, I do conclude that there are many local attributes which demonstrate that this is a landscape which has a considerable importance and value at a local or community level, in particular to the landscape setting of Tenterden, and as an attractive area of accessible countryside with a number of distinctive characteristics close to the heart of the town. Visual effects as a consequence of the removal of existing features on local views. The proposed residential development would be particularly prominent in views west from footpath AB12. No longer distance views have been identified from the A1B to the east or the immediate surrounding area. There would be a change to the residential visual amenity of properties bordering the appeal site, and particularly those on Appledore Road with a more open aspect. But this would, I accept, in part be mitigated by the proposed landscape buffer over time. The LVA concludes that there will be moderate to major adverse visual effects on views towards Tenterden for walkers using footpath AB12, and I particularly reference the viewpoints 5A and B from the LVA. The photomontage is included in the SR in the LVA, and the photomontage also at page 60 of the design and access statement, which we haven't been to yet, illustrate the anticipated change to the views and the overall experience for users of AB12. Views would be transformed from the current rural views over fields to the wooded settlement edge to one dominated by blocks of residential development adjacent to the path, restricting outward views to the occasional breaks along the greenways. The experience of the southern section would be exacerbated by the presence of the pavilion and car parking, which would enclose the footpath to the east. There would be new features such as the orchard and of course the country park, and there would be potential for enhanced management of the features on the route to the east and within development, such as the ponds and hedgerows. But in my view, the predominant change would impact on the experience of users of footpath AB12 and would be the dominating influence of the development bordering the path. In my view, the following conclusions drawn by the inspector in relation to visual impacts and effects of the 1989 application for residential development on the appeal site remain relevant to this application. The existing views remain very attractive, the predominant impression being of the church and other buildings set in a swathe of trees rising above the fields and hedgerows in the foreground. Development which would be of a relatively intense nature would appear as a substantial intrusion into the views of Tenterden. This would clearly be detrimental to the character and appearance of the area. And finally, turning to the appropriateness of the proposal in terms of design, layout, and the scale and quantity of development. The proposed extent to residential development remains largely the same as that relating to the 250 house scheme, albeit that development is now centred on smaller parcels set within the retained landscape features. The proposed quantum of development and layout would, in my view, still result in a substantial incursion into open countryside. The residential densities within each parcel remain high, in particular in the western parts of the development, where there was to be 40 to 45 dph. The need to retain existing landscape features would result in pockets of higher density residential development. In my view, these are densities more suited to an urban scheme as opposed to one set on a rural settlement edge. Despite the reduction in numbers, the retention of existing features and the creation of the greenways, I conclude the development would still result in the transformation of the existing wooded transitional settlement edge to more of an open, harsh settlement edge following the line of footpath AB12. And I consider that the photomontages support this conclusion. The proposed development would, in my view, not sit sympathetically within the wider landscape of the appeal site. The loss of this wedge of countryside would substantially alter the overall settlement pattern, resulting in a rounding off to the settlement edge, which the inspector at the 1989 inquiry concluded would be harmful to the linear form of the town and proximity of the countryside to the heart of the town. Again, my conclusion that these judgments remain relevant to the current proposal on the appeal side. And moving on to my concluding statements. For the reasons set out above, I conclude the proposed development would result in harm to the character and appearance of the surrounding area. With specific regard to reason for refusal 2, I conclude the existing land does contribute positively to the landscape setting to the southeast side of Tenterden, and the proposals would cause substantial harm to the character and appearance of the settlement edge. The proposed development would not sit sympathetically within the wider landscape. In my view, the scale and intensity of the development would not only result in the loss of an area of open countryside, which is an intrinsic part of the landscape setting to Tenterden, but would also create a harsh and less sensitive settlement edge. So I therefore conclude that proposals would be contrary to the specific elements of policies HOU5, SP1, SP2, SP6, and ENB3A I set out in section 2.4 of my proof of evidence. I conclude the proposed development would not conserve or enhance the natural environment of the borough and would not sit sympathetically in the wider landscape.
Thank you, Mr. Withycombe. I won't ask you to read in relation to reason for refusal 3 and 4 relating to Appledore Road on the Avenue and the evidence on trees, particularly because evidence has been given in the round table.
Previously, yeah.
I don't want to repeat that. So that completes your evidence in chief. Thank you very much, Mr. Withycombe.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Howell-Williams and Mr. Withycombe. I'm happy to continue for at least another half hour. Is that okay with Mr. Withycombe and Mr. White? And then, unfortunately, I don't think you're likely to finish your cross-examination in half an hour. Is that right, Mr.
Completely,
White?
sir. And also, in the light of your comment before this started, that would probably be done for the day. I've confirmed my attendance at my directors' board meeting. So, frankly, I'd prefer to rise now and start afresh in the morning.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Then I'm happy to do it that way. I'm bearing in mind that we are slightly behind, and but certainly I think we've had a reasonable stab at most of these topics. The only thing I'd like to say before we adjourn then is that that this third party has suggested that they're available on a Friday to give their evidence, but I haven't actually been given any time, and obviously they've got to somehow be a bit flexible with how they fit in. But I would I mean, I don't know whether there's any concerns about that, but I would hope that I could possibly hear them sometime on Friday. The unfortunate thing is I don't think they seem to think that they have to be flexible themselves, but we'll see how that works. But anyway, I don't know whether there's any objections to hearing them on a Friday. I can then reply to them that Friday might be able to be fitted in, but I'd prefer to hear them perhaps early Friday, and then carry on that day. But we'll see how that goes. Are there any objections to that?
No, not on behalf of the council, sir. Thank you.
No. Right. Okay then. In that case,
I just have the health warning about fairness, and if third party, if it relates principally to Mr. Smith's evidence, I won't be best pleased, because obviously he'll have given evidence. And that puts the appellant at a disadvantage. But I'll hold fire and see what's said.
I mean,
can I make a suggestion overnight, sir, that Mr. Howell Williams and you contemplate whether we switch, as we're behind on the timetable, whether we switch the public rights of way round table with the sports round table to ensure that Mr. Miners is actually dealt with this week, in the light of the fact that he's then unavailable next week.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to do that. Is that in agreement with Mr. Howell Williams? Sorry, Mr. Howell.
Mute.
Yeah, I think you put yourself off mute, and then
I know.
It's not very responsive sometimes, but yeah.
No, it's my fault entirely. As a matter of principle, I'm sure that's right, but I'd like just to confirm first thing in the morning, in case there's some problem with Mr. Mayer's availability a little earlier. But in principle, I see no reason. One thought, sir, is that just hopefully to give you some confidence, not unduly, is that it may just be that the ecology section of evidence, which at the moment stretches across one whole day, is perhaps sort of a little pessimistic.
Well, I mean, yeah, there might be areas where we can make up time, but there might be areas where it might take longer. But we'll have to see how it works out. But anyway, I'm happy to adjourn now, and we'll see how we get on tomorrow. But thank you very much, and for bearing with all the technical problems. And I'm just hoping that I don't get the same technical problems again tomorrow. But it's been a little bit of a problem on that. But anyway, so in that case, I'll now adjourn until 9:30 tomorrow. So we'll resume at 9:30. So the